It's Halloween, so I thought I would do something a little bit different today. I found a piece I wrote way back, which I naturally forgot about, but when I listened to it, I thought it could be a nice Halloween theme song for like a Halloween TV show or a movie. It's a pretty quirky piece, not real serious, but I feel like Halloween is kind of a quirky holiday anyway. And funny enough, as I was analyzing this piece to write this episode, I actually found some mistakes in the writing and the orchestration, which I am going to show you. Because this is why we analyze music. We look back at our own works to learn from our mistakes, and we look at other composers' works to learn from their successes. So today we're going to break down the composition as well as the orchestration and talk about some common elements in holiday theme music. Let's listen to the piece first and then we'll start to break it down. I also threw together a little video with just some stock footage just for fun. Check it out. This is kind of a strange piece because it's in 3/4 time signature and the harmony really plays into that 3/4 time signature, so it's kind of like a waltz, but it's in C minor with lots of chromaticism, so it's kind of like a haunting waltz, I guess you could say. The first 2 bars just introduce that C minor chord, sort of announcing the key, and then the melody starts in bar 3. The entire 8-bar phrase can really be broken up into 2 bars, 2 bars, and then 4 bars. The first 2 bars contain this melodic motif, which contains 2 chromatic neighbor tones. A chromatic neighbor tone is a decoration of a note that comes about by playing a half step above or a half step below on the weak beat and then returning to the original note. So the note that's in the key is on the downbeat and it kind of surrounds the chromatic or outside note. In this case, the chromatic neighbor tones are D flat and B natural, neither of which are in the key of C minor, and they're both trapped in between 2 Cs. And this could be any chord tone, I just happen to trap it between C, which is the root of the C minor chord. If you look at the rhythm of the motif, you have 4 eighth notes, you have 2 quarter notes, and then ending on a half note. If you look at bars 5 and 6, it has the exact same rhythm. The 4 eighth notes, the 2 quarter notes, and the half note. Now you could say the first part of this motif is really just an inversion of this part of the motif with an added intervallic augmentation. But I would probably just call these 2 bars a loose imitation, because the rhythm is exactly the same, but all the notes are different. Imitation is something you come across a lot in counterpoint. In this part of the phrase, the F sharp is the chromatic note, which is outside the key of C minor, and it's used as a chromatic approach tone to the G, which is a chord tone. And then immediately after that, you have F natural as a passing tone between G and E. And remember, everything up to this point is still over C minor chords. We haven't changed chords for the first 6 bars. Measure 7 is the first chord change. E minor is not in the key of C minor because C minor has an E flat. So in this context, we would call the E minor a chromatic mediant chord. Chromatic mediant chords are related by a major or minor third. They share one or more common tones, or they share a quality such as major or minor. And the A minor is also a chromatic mediant chord, as the key of C minor has an A flat and not an A natural. So we have 2 chromatic mediant chords. This E7 is the 5 chord of the A minor, so it's just giving the A minor a little more prominence. And the B diminished is just a diminished chord on the 7th degree of harmonic minor, which is really just a substitution for the dominant 5 chord G7. The second half of the 8-bar phrase starts off with an imitation again, but then it takes off in another direction, literally. So it's the same rhythm again, the 4 eighth notes and the quarter note, but instead of moving upwards with the chromatic neighbor tone, this time it's moving downwards to a half step below. We're also over the different chords for the second half, so the notes are also different. So the only real relationship this has with the original motif is the rhythm. But this time, instead of landing on a half note and coming to a little bit of a rest, I embellished this section and I wrote 2 eighth notes walking upwards to what essentially is just a dotted quarter note with a tie over the bar line. So this gives us a little bit more rhythmic energy and lets our ear know that we're not resting here like we did the first time. And then this little phrase just kind of runs upwards, finally landing on the B natural over the B diminished chord. In bar 11, it repeats for almost the entire first 4 bars of the phrase, and then we get a nice little variation for the ending. The variation begins at the end of the 4th bar of the phrase, which is actually bar 14 at this point. Originally, there was a half note at the end of the phrase. I shortened it just a bit so I could add this little 8th note, which gives us some nice forward moving energy, sort of propelling us into the next bar. This bar also repeats almost exactly the same as it did the first time, except for the last note, instead of moving downwards, it's moving now upwards. And then the motif essentially gets transposed up a major third. The reason is because I changed the chord in this measure. The first time there was E minor and then E7 going to A minor, but now I have an F minor major 7. So this part of the melody is transposed upwards to fit the new chord. And the A7 is the 5 chord of the D minor, and here the melody slows down to just straight quarter notes. The kind of slowing down of the rhythm from all those 8th notes to just steady quarter notes kind of lets us know that we're coming to a point of rest in the next measure, and we do when we land on the D and hold it for 2 full measures. This B flat chord at the end is the flat 7th chord in the key of C minor, but as you'll see in a moment, it immediately changes to B flat minor in the next bar when we go to the B section. In this B section, things get a little bit weirder. I'm still using chromatic medians now from the perspective of B flat minor. That's where you get G flat and D flat minor from. But it doesn't really settle down anywhere in particular. It's just sort of floating around these chromatic median chords. But because it's a B section that's also followed by a C section that sort of builds into a climax and then ultimately goes back to a version of the A section, I think this somewhat unsettled nature works really well. The F diminished 7 is just a substitute for the 5 of the G flat chord. This E minor chord kind of comes out of nowhere. I think at this point, I just really enjoyed the stepwise bass motion from E down to E flat down to D flat. And I originally had them all being minor chords, which means this would be a chromatic approach chord. But then I decided to change this to E flat major, so that way they both had a G in them, so they shared a common tone, and it gives a really nice smooth connection. So even though these chords aren't exactly related, they actually work really nicely together because of that common tone. The B section melody is really simple. I had a pretty high energy melody for the A section, so I wanted to slow things down for some contrast in the B section. The rhythm of the melody is super simple. It's almost entirely quarter notes and half notes with just 2 8th notes in the middle. And the melodic choices are just a lot of chord tones of the harmony down below, with a few melodic notes being whole steps above chord tones so that they don't clash. The only exception is this note C over the E minor 7 chord. That does clash with the 5th of the chord B. I like the sound of this though because the dissonance doesn't last for very long before it's sort of resolved in the chord. Because it's repeated, sort of acting as an anticipation, but the harmony in the next bar is changed, so this goes from being dissonant with the harmony to being consonant with the harmony. And even though the rhythm's completely different, you can see how I got the basic idea for the B section by taking the beginning fragment of the A section melody and just stretching out the rhythm. It's also different notes over top of different chords, but you can see how it's kind of vaguely related. Taking little fragments of some of your ideas and then developing them and reworking them to use in other parts of the music is a really great way to keep everything sounding cohesive. In the B section, I also changed the bass voice to be a little bit more active. In the A section, it was bass note on the downbeat followed by rests. But in the B section, I just have steady arpeggiated notes in the bass voice. Then we get to the C section starting in measure 28. The whole point of this section is to build an intensity and eventually modulate into the key of E flat minor. All these chords pretty much come from E flat minor. F diminished is the 2 chord. The B flat minor is the diatonic 5 chord to E flat minor, whereas the B flat dominant 7 is the borrowed chord from E flat harmonic minor. So they're just 2 different 5 chords from 2 different parallel types of E flat minor scales. And the D flat minor is just a chromatically altered flat 7 chord. In the key of E flat minor on the flat 7th degree, you would have a D flat major triad. I just chromatically altered it to make it minor and to just kind of keep that constant structure of minor chords going because I really just like the way it sounded. But ultimately at the climax, we have a 2-5-1 to E flat minor. And then we have 4 measures of just that E flat minor chord repeated. And I also wrote little notes to myself, and I wrote build here, and at the end I wrote slowly make the texture smaller. This is just to remind myself what I was thinking when I get to the orchestration stage. If you're writing a sketch that will eventually be turned into an orchestral piece, you should always be thinking about things like that during the writing process. What instruments might be playing the melody or the accompaniment, so you can make sure you're writing in the proper ranges and taking into consideration the physical capabilities of each instrument. When the melody repeats, you'll notice it's exactly the same except it's transposed from C minor up to E flat minor. So the entire melody along with all of the chords are just transposed up a minor third. And it stays the same all the way until the end. This is pretty common in large orchestral works and film scoring. It's a great way to use the same material but make it a little more interesting than just repeating it the same way as the first time. And then I have a little 4-bar outro, which is really just an embellishment of the 3/4 meter. There's a heavy accented bass note on the downbeat, and the other two beats have E flat minor and D minor. What I'm doing here is just taking the E flat minor chord and moving it down a half step chromatically. So these two chords are really not related. I just like the chromatic sound of it moving down a half step, so I just went with it. And I know I wanted a crescendo at the end, so it gets really loud and really fat sounding. So there's definitely going to be some, brass and percussion in here. So I always have those ideas in the back of my mind when I'm doing the piano sketch. Now I want to go over the orchestration. Some of the instrument choices that I made are really common in holiday themes, especially Christmas and Halloween. Let's take a look. The initial harmony is in the string sections, played pizzicato. This means to pluck the strings with your fingers instead of bowing them. It's a very different sound. The cello takes the bass note, and the violas, violins 2 and violins 1, play that upper structure of the triad. The harp for the first two measures just plays the note C in octaves on the downbeats to really emphasize the key center, and once the melody starts, it plays the full chord. The bass note in the harp chord is the same as the cello, the root, and the fifth. The melody is being played by the piano and the vibraphone in octaves. It's important to understand that when you're writing for the orchestra, that professional live players are really good at balancing. So adding another instrument like this to the melody isn't necessarily making it louder. It's specifically to achieve a unique tone color by mixing the natural timbre of multiple instruments. So even though this isn't played by a live orchestra, I always write music keeping in mind that someday it might be. So all the writing needs to be appropriate for the instruments and the players. I picked the piano and the vibraphone because the melody is highly percussive in the beginning. The little dots above the note heads are staccato markings, and that means to play half of the value. So all these are actually 16th notes followed by a 16th note rest. So the beginning of the motif is very punchy and percussive. So percussive instruments help to highlight that percussive nature of the melody. But it doesn't have to be that way. Almost any instrument could play this. In fact, I have a violin taking over for the repeat after this, and it sounds pretty cool. But it's definitely a different sound than when the percussion instruments play it. They have a certain sharpness to the attack of the note that other instruments don't have. I also have the celesta sort of highlighting the melody in key spots. So it highlights the end of the first little motif here, and then it does it again the second time, and then it skips a measure and just tags the ending of the melodic phrase. Having other instruments kind of come in and out playing just some highlights of the melodic ideas really helps to make things unique. And that's not limited to the melody. You could do the same thing with the harmony if you wanted to. Also, when you play any of these metallic percussive instruments like the vibraphone, celesta, glockenspiel, they tend to elicit the feelings in the back of our brains of like celebratory holiday music, whether it's Halloween or Christmas, or the feeling of the magic and the mystical. Now, whether this is something that happens subconsciously that we don't know about, or whether it's just because we're used to hearing those sounds in music written for the holidays and in movies about magic, I don't know. Maybe it's a bit of both. Either way, it's something you should be aware of because these are very useful tools to have at your disposal. On the repeat, a solo violin plays the melody. This is way different than the piano vibraphone combination we just heard. Varying the tone color in this way makes a very simple repeat much more exciting. For the harmony, the harp is now playing what the pizzicato strings were doing in the previous measures with the root and fifth on the downbeat, and then the upper structure of the triad on the other 2 beats of the measure. And that little accent marking on the bass notes will make live players dig in a little bit more. In the first couple of bars, we had multiple string sections playing the harmony all together. Violins could have, 14 or 16 players just in one section, and we had the whole string sections playing the chords. So now the harmony's not in full string sections, but rather just one harp, it's not going to be a very big sound. So I have the harmony doubled by the tuba, the bassoons, and the clarinets. The tuba and the bassoon are playing the bass note. The bassoon plays exactly with the harp, but the tuba holds for the entire measure. This adds some variation and also fills out the measure a bit. I'm thinking in terms of tone color here. The bassoon has that nasal biting quality to it, and the tuba, at least in the relatively soft dynamic, has a more mellow tone color. The woodwind's going to sweeten the tone a little bit as well, and the resonance does get more complex and powerful, but again, live players are really good at balancing, so you're thinking more about tone color than anything else. And the clarinets are playing the upper structure of the chord, just like we had earlier in the strings. I chose 3 clarinets for a very specific reason. Woodwind instruments have the widest range of tone colors between them, and because of that, they can be very difficult to blend together. So if I split this chord up between, say, English horn, clarinet, and flute, it wouldn't be as balanced or as well blended. So I chose 3 clarinets so the tone color is very uniform throughout the chord. I also added the violas playing the 3rd and 5th of the chord. That notation, arco, means to return to bowing, so it's no longer pizzicato, but they're actually bowing the notes. And then I have a divisi. Divisi means that only half the players are going to play the bottom note, and half the players are going to play that top note, instead of all the players playing both notes. This makes the overall sound much smaller and softer, which is what you want in an additional background part that serves just to kind of thicken the texture a little bit. Again, there are no live players here, but I'm always imagining that there are, because you should always strive to get better at writing for a real orchestra, so that when the day finally comes and you get that opportunity, you're already ready. So these long, steady notes weren't in the original piano sketch, but I added them in the orchestration stage just because I felt it needed it. And I'll do that quite often when I'm in the orchestration stage, is I'll add little harp runs or just little background ideas that weren't actually part of the original sketch. I used the glockenspiel to highlight the very end of the melody this time, and I also wrote a little harp run, which gives the music a little bit of energy and forward momentum to sort of pull our ears into the B section. The first 3 notes are the notes of the B-flat triad, and then the rest are scale tones of B-flat major. I also used a quintuplet run, which is 5 notes in the space of 1 beat, and the reason was because I wanted the run to be just a little bit faster than 16th notes, so I sort of squeezed an extra note in there. Septuplets or 7-note runs are really common because you can just run through the whole scale, but you should mix it up sometimes with 5-note runs or 9-note runs or whatever you're feeling. In the B section, the tuba and the French horns play the harmony in the same way as we heard before. So that's the 3rd type of tone color we've now had for these parts. Remember, the original chords were in string sections, played pizzicato, and the second time it was in the harp and the upper woodwinds, and now it's in the tuba and the French horns. The horns are also doubled by the violas playing pizzicato. And divisi in this case means the violas would split into 3 sections, 1 for each note. But that pizzicato blending with the horns is a nice unique tone color. And the tuba is doubled by the harp, which continues to play this little descending line through the root and the 5th of the chords, which is something I added again just for some little subtle variation. The melody is in bassoons, clarinets, and flutes in 3 different octaves. These 3 instruments together have a really unique quality of sound to them. And in the second half, I have the piccolo, which joins in the upper part of the melody for a little bit more airy brightness to the top of the line. The next section is a kind of a little build to a climax. As you can see, there are too many staves to really look at it as a whole. So let's just listen to this section one more time so you can really get the sound in your head, and then we're going to zoom in and break it down section by section. And the string sections are playing the full chord again, and the contrabass plays the bass note, and now the cellos, along with the violins and the violins 2, are playing the upper triad, with violins 1 doubling the cello up an octave, which sort of caps off the top of the chord. There was one chord in the piano sketch where I wrote an extra note, so someone had to either play double stops if possible, or split up into 2 sections. So I split the violas divisied between these two notes since they're in the middle voice, and then it goes right back to a unison texture. Now you can see this crescendo marking right here. It means it's getting louder and louder until it gets to the forte dynamic, and then there's a decrescendo making it softer and softer. But as I'm doing these crescendos, I'm also adding things and taking them away, which is called an orchestrated crescendo or an orchestrated decrescendo. The choir, which also has a crescendo marking, so it's getting louder, is also expanding in registers as we move. It starts with one single note, then it expands to 2 notes, and then finally 3 notes, and then at the climax you get the full chords. So it's expanding and getting fuller as it's getting louder. The harp 1 has these little triplet runs to kind of add some energy as we're building up into the forte dynamic, and then the harp 2 comes in with the chords in unison with the choir. I noticed while working on this episode that I made a mistake in the harp part, so let's zoom in and take a look. If you're writing for a live orchestra with a real harp player, the harp only has 7 notes per octave. So per each octave, you get one string that's some type of C, whether it's C flat, C natural, or C sharp. You get another string that's one type of D, whether it's D flat, D natural, or D sharp, and so on. So here's the mistake I made. While playing this little run right here over a D flat minor chord, I have a D flat for the D string, I have an E flat for the E string, the F is an F flat, the G is a G flat, but then I have an A flat and an A natural. The A natural is really B double flat, which is what you get with a D flat minor scale. But played at this tempo with this rhythm, one note right after the other, there's not going to be enough time for the harp player to change the tuning of that string. So this is not playable on a real harp. So I would have to make some sort of change here if it was for a live orchestra. Now the next measure is a different story. Notice that I have a B flat and a B natural, but there's no C throughout this part of the run. So this B natural could be the C string tuned to C flat, which is the same as B. So you can get clever sometimes with the harp parts, but that's not the case for this measure. There are other notes that are retuned throughout, like this F natural and this E natural and quite a few others, so I'm actually pretty sure that none of this is playable on a harp. So if I was writing this for a live orchestra, I have a couple of options. The first option is to just take this and put it up in a different instrument that has all the chromatic notes, such as the piano, or just keep it in the woodwinds or string sections. But the other option is, because I have 2 harps in this piece, I could give one measure to the second harp and the third measure to the other harp as well, so they sort of go back and forth and maybe dovetail them over top of each other so it connects smoothly. But if I really wanted this exact sound of this run, I would probably just put it in a different instrument. The piano's doubling the chords as well, and after it gets to that climactic part, when it starts to get quieter with the decrescendo, I'm also paring back the notes. So it's 3 notes, then it's 2 notes, then it's just 1 note. So it's getting quieter, but also smaller and softer. The timpani plays tremolos. That's what those slashes through the stem mean. So it's just like a steady roll on the drum head, and it also swells in volume. Notice that I didn't use the timpani right away. It was resting for the first couple of measures. So I staggered it in just like the harp and the choir. The snare drum as well only plays when we get to the climax, just for that nice extra percussive punchy effect. But notice how the entrance of the timpani and the snare and even this harp run are all staggered. They don't all come in together on the first measure of this build section. If everything always started on the same downbeat, you would just get a swell in volume of every instrument, and it's a really static and somewhat boring quality of sound, at least if you use it too often. Staggering in the instruments offers the ear a nice bit of variation. The brass section does the same thing. Their entrance is staggered in and out. Now the trombones, there's 3 trombone players reading on one staff. So for this note, I only want one player to play it, so I write A1. If I didn't have that there, then all 3 players would play in unison. But I want their entrance staggered intentionally to slowly add instruments as we move along. So when we get to 2 notes, I have 2 instruments playing. When you get to 3 notes, you could write A3, but you don't have to, because if there are 3 trombone players, and each trombone can only play physically 1 note at a time, they would have to divide this chord up evenly. And then I did the same thing with the decrescendo. I'm just slowly taking notes away and making it softer and smaller as it's getting quieter. Notice the tuba doesn't come in right away either, and it's also the first instrument of the brass family to leave. The horns and the trumpets do the same thing. They come in, they swell, they get nice and loud, and then they're sort of paired back one at a time as they're getting quieter and softer. And the entire woodwind section does the exact same thing. They're just playing the chords. They come in kind of one at a time, and they get smaller and they leave in different parts. Cor anglaise is just the English horn, but that along with contrabassoon come in first. Then you have the oboe staggered in, the clarinets, finally the flutes. When we get to the forte dynamic, the piccolo also joins in up top. And notice as we get smaller and smaller, the exiting of the instruments is staggered as well, which again is called an orchestrated decrescendo. Now we get to the repeat of the A section melody, but this time it's transposed to E flat minor. The melody this time is in just solo piano, but it's doubling itself in octaves. So it's a much fuller, but also a much brighter sound with that upper octave added. The harmony is back in the string sections, played pizzicato again, and the harp is also doing the same thing as it did in the very beginning. This time I've added the contrabassoon and the bassoons on the bass notes, and I've added the horns to the upper structure of the triad. So the overall tone color of the harmony is a little bit different than the first time. This time I also have the choir filling out the background harmony, which we didn't have the first time. It starts off small and it kind of grows and expands as we go along, and then it shrinks back down and then repeats the same way. The repeat of the second half going into the ending, we have a really nice big full texture. Again, it's a little much to be looking at all at once, so let's hear what it sounds like and then we'll zoom in and go through each section. This time, instead of a solo violin, we have the violins 1 and violins 2 playing, as well as the violas down 1 octave. If we scroll up to the top of the score here, you'll see that the flutes also double the melody, and then the oboes and the English horn also come in to double the second half of the melody. Woodwinds in unison with the strings will increase the resonance and amplify the tone, with the strings predominating the texture. The bass clarinet now plays the bass note, along with the tuba and the contrabass. Notice that that's one member of the string family, one member of the brass family, and one member of the woodwind family on the bass note. This is very common in a large orchestral texture. The timpani kind of plays along with the bass note as well. The bass drum is added on the downbeat of every other measure for some deep, punchy percussion. Now, the bass drum is an instrument of indefinite pitch, so you tune it for resonance, but not for a specific pitch. There is no specific pitch. A bass drum by itself will just sound like a loud thud. But if it's paired with a bass instrument like the contrabass or the tuba or the bassoon, it will sort of absorb into that bass note and make it more powerful and thunderous. The cellos are paired with the choir, and if you scroll up a little bit, you'll see that the trombones are also paired with them. And they're just kind of playing these smooth legato background chords just to really fill it out. And the first harp is playing the chords along with the bassoon. So there's a lot of doubling in different parts here because we have a very large orchestrated melody. At the end of the melody, the strings sustain the melody note for 2 measures. During that time, the harp plays this little run, which starts out as 16th notes, and then again uses those quintuplets. And it's just playing scale runs. It's nothing really out of the ordinary. But if you look up at the woodwind section at the same time, the flutes, the oboes, and the English horn are sustaining it while doing a trill. You can see how it adds a little bit of energy, and when it's combined with these scale runs in the clarinets and the harp, it kind of gets this little bit of a feel of chaos to it. Notice the flute stops the trills after 1 measure and joins in the clarinets and the harp for the run, and the piccolo takes over for the trill. This is just a nice subtle variation instead of keeping things very static. Subtle variation and avoiding writing really static parts is key. Now for the final 4 bars where that little 2-chord progression just kind of repeats, nothing super crazy is going on. Every section is playing the E flat minor and the D minor chords, and most of them are playing in their respective registers. Okay, the strings are playing the chord just as you would expect. The choir is doing the chords minus the bass note. The harp is playing the bottom notes of the chord. The piano is playing the entire chord again, just for that nice punchy percussive effect. We have the bass drum on every other measure. The snare drum adds that really nice snappy, punchy brightness to it, and it's also got some grace notes for a little variation. The timpani plays on the downbeats, except for the very last measure, it plays all 3 beats with the accents. So it just has a really nice final ending to it. This choir section on the chords mixed in with the brass is a really awesome, really powerful sound. The tuba and the bass trombones are in octaves, then they switch to unison, then octaves, and then unison again, just for some variation in the sound, with the trombones and the trumpets playing the upper parts of the chords. What's really weird here is the horns. I would probably do this a little differently if I was writing this now. It's just weird because I wrote 5 horn parts, which is unusual. It's more common to see 4 or 6 horns, and I think the reason is because when you're writing a forte dynamic or louder, you need 2 horns for every 1 trumpet to be able to balance, because the horns kind of max out in volume, but the trumpets can get quite a bit louder. So I would probably use 6 horns, doubling a total of 3 notes, just like the 3 trumpets. And the woodwinds are the same. You get the contrabassoon, the bassoon, and the bass clarinet playing the bass notes, and the rest of the woodwind section is playing the entire upper chord, with the piccolo doubling the flute up 1 octave, just for that nice kind of bright, shiny effect up top. Let's listen to that ending one more time. I bet that ending would sound epic in a live orchestra. All right, that wraps up today's episode. Thanks for watching. Happy Halloween. See you next time.